Welcome to Two Pretty Good Bad Men, an Alias Smith & Jones podcast. We are not covering an episode today because A, there is too much to discuss to shove it all at the beginning of one, and B, I want to be respectful to both Pete Duel and Roger Davis. They both deserve it. And I know Pete still has surviving relatives, and I would never want to disrespect them either. This isn't going to be fun, and trigger warning for suicide. I'll understand if people don't want to listen to this one. I just feel ignoring it or briefly addressing it would be wrong, or I guess not treating it with the weight it deserves. And didn't the network already do that shit at the time? Let's be honest. Who wants to be like the network? Let's talk about what happened with Pete Duel, Roger Davis, and Alias Smith & Jones. Thursday evening, December 30th, 1971, saw Pete Duel returning to his home after an ADR session at ASJ. He, his girlfriend Diane Ray, and his friend Hal Frizzle all sat together and watched that night's episode, Miracle at Santa Marta. After the episode, Frizzle left and Pete and Diane watched a Lakers game. Pete had been drinking heavily the whole evening. Eventually, Diane went to bed. Around 1:30 in the morning of December 31st, Diane woke up to find Pete in the bedroom retrieving something. It was a .38 revolver. He turned to her and said, "I'll see you later," and went out into the living room. A few minutes later, she heard a gunshot. Peter Duel, at only 31, had died by suicide. He was found under his Christmas tree. Frizzle believes that Pete tried to call him that night. Quote, "About 1 a.m. my telephone rang, but I was asleep. By the time I could get to it, it had stopped ringing. The only guy who would have phoned me at that hour would have been Pete. Often in the night when he was lonely or wanted to chat, he would phone me and we would talk for hours." End quote. Dennis Fimple, who played Kyle on the show, felt tremendous guilt about his death. They had plans that evening to see A Clockwork Orange, when at the last minute Pete was called in for the looping session. Dennis didn't feel like sticking around, and he told Pete as much. Pete didn't seem to mind, saying they'd go some other time. Quote, "If I'd stayed and gone with him, maybe it wouldn't have happened." End quote. I've lost people close to me, and I completely understand that feeling of guilt, of maybe you could have changed it if only you'd been there, so my heart really broke for Fimple when I first read that quote. Suicidal ideation was sadly nothing new for Pete. As a teenager, he had resolved to take his life once. He spoke of that time saying, quote, "I didn't know what was going to happen to me if I died, but it seemed the only sensible thing to do." End quote. But ultimately, he didn't go through with it because, quote, "I discovered there was one thing I didn't have, the guts to take my own life. So in truth, I just chickened out, and after a while the urge went away." End quote. Shortly before Pete's death, he had campaigned for a spot on the board of the Screen Actors Guild. He ended up not winning. He hung the rejection telegram on the wall and shot a hole through it. Friends and family disagree on whether or not Pete would have committed the act had he been sober. His sister Pamela was quoted as saying that she was sure he wouldn't have. Producer Joe Swirling wasn't so sure because Pete seemed in high spirits the week leading up to his death. Quote, "That sort of fits into this thing one hears about suicidal people. When they make up their mind that they're going to do it, they all of a sudden for a brief period feel like the monkey's off their back, and the albatross is not around their neck anymore, and they seem happy. And then boom, they're out the window." End quote. I'm not going to speculate any further on that. I certainly don't know what was going through Peter's mind that night. What's not speculation is that Pete was deeply depressed. He felt trapped in his contract, in his series. He was frustrated because he couldn't solve all the world's problems. Ben Murphy said, quote, "He took everything to heart. If a whale died off the coast, that bothered Peter. Social injustice bothered Peter. He was an idealist to his core." End quote. Joe Swirling echoed the sentiment, quote, "The impression that I had of Peter was that he tended to assume responsibility for the evils of the world. You know, as long as people were starving in India, he was frustrated because he couldn't do anything about it." End quote. Glenn Larson said, quote, "Pete was a very talented kid, but he was troubled. He was difficult in many ways, and seemed to be so unhappy, which was a shame. I heard Peter's negativisms? I don't know if that's a real word. Anyway, but I didn't respond to them, never knowing how dark it ran in him." End quote. He went on to say, quote, "I think the most important word in our language is perspective, and if you lose it, you lose track of an awful lot of reasons for living. I think Peter had them, I just don't think he saw them. I felt we lost a very talented guy." End quote. As I said in an earlier episode, Pete was very close to his family, particularly his siblings. He was quoted in Tiger Beat as saying that his sister Pamela was his favorite singer. She worried for Pete's well-being, saying, quote, "He stood there and told me how sad he was, and I began to cry, and I walked over to him and put my arms around him, and I said, 'You can't leave me.' And he said, 'I watched you.' He said, 'You'll be fine,' and I knew. I begged him not to hurt himself, but there were definitely signs that he had thought about it." End quote. Pete expressed that his brother Jeffrey was his best friend. Quote, "My brother and I are very close. We were close as children, growing up. We're still close now." And, quote, "Jeff and I find ourselves judging, comparing, but we handle it well with each other. We've always talked about it. He is my best friend, my brother." End quote. Jeffrey said, quote, "Peter always felt there were other things he wanted to do. Acting was not enough in itself. He wanted to do other things for people he considered more meaningful, and he wanted to have better parts. Possibly that was a shame, because he forgot how much happiness he gave to so many people." End quote. Jeffrey took in Pete's dogs, Shoshone and Carol, after Pete died. In one interview he said, quote, "No, I don't mind. It's true I was very bitter at the time, but now I've come to understand that, in a sense, what happened to Pete has helped me become what I am today. I've already told you how close we were. Well, at the time of his death made me lose all interest in my work. The sense of loss was so deep, so grievous, that I wanted to quit acting, because I wasn't enjoying it, and in a way blamed the system for Pete's death. So no, I don't mind talking about Pete. The feeling of sadness is still there, sharp as ever, but I've come to understand that there is just no point in sustaining the bitterness." End quote. Finally, I want to share this quote from Ben Murphy. Quote, "I'm sure if Pete were alive today, and I would go, 'Petey, why did you do it?' I'm sure he would give me that impish grin, and he would smile, and you would love him, and he'd go, 'I goofed up.' But I'm not sure he wouldn't do it again." End quote. Pete's memorial service was held at the Self-Realization Temple on Sunset Boulevard. Of course, his family was in attendance, and almost everyone from the ASJ crew. One notable absence was Ben Murphy. He felt his presence there would be a distraction at the time, when the focus should be on Peter and his family, but he did still pay his respects. He went into the funeral home the day before for a private visit with Pete. Roger Davis, on the other hand, did attend. He felt it was the right thing to do because he had known not only Pete, but also Pamela and Jeffrey. Huggins advised him against it, feeling that it would further traumatize him just before taking over the part of Hayes. Rogers admits that Huggins was right on that front, but he doesn't regret attending. The Duel family accompanied Pete's body back to New York, where there was another service held at First Baptist Church in Penfield. Sister Pam sang "Free Again," which Pete had once cited as his favorite song by his favorite singer. He was buried in Penfield. Back on that awful morning of December 31st, once the news of Pete's passing spread, the producers and network unfortunately had practical things to consider. They were in the middle of a series. Hell, they were in the middle of an episode. When Roy Huggins heard the news, he immediately wanted to end the show. That would have been the right move, in my opinion, and I'm not speaking of the quality of the show going forward. I just mean for all of his co-workers, or at least give them a break. End the season and maybe come back the following fall. Maybe. Huggins and Joe Swirling decided they didn't want Ben to hear the news from the media, so Swirling and his assistant, Dorothy Bailey, went over to his apartment around 6 a.m. on December 31st. Ben said he was shocked but not surprised by Pete's suicide. The two weren't friends off set, but they did work very well together on set. Ben saw Pete's unhappiness with the show, but the two never discussed it. Ben was afraid that Pete would try and get out of his contract, but he certainly didn't assume this would happen. Swirling told Ben to stay home that day, and he did. I mean, who can blame him? Huggins and Swerling went to the set ready to send the crew home and shut down the whole production. But ABC decided, nah, you guys signed a contract and you're going to honor that contract. Shoot around Pete. That was their response. Shoot around Pete. Guys, they threatened to sue the show if they didn't keep production running. Have you ever heard of anything so heartless? I mean, I'm sure you have, but this is pretty bad. Director Alexander Singer was disgusted, but he and the crew did what they could to shoot usable footage without Pete. Head of television for Universal, Frank Price, felt stuck. ABC was putting pressure on him to keep going. Huggins, Swerling, and everyone on the production side were in a state of shock and grief and wanted to quit. Price ultimately caved to ABC. Quote, "If you're doing Hamlet and Hamlet dies one night, you don't say we retire this play. You cast a new Hamlet and go on." End quote. Okay, this isn't quite the same thing, and I think you damn well know that, sir. If they had to continue the show, the only option they had was to recast Hannibal Hayes. I've seen some fans express that they should have written in an entirely new character. I disagree completely with that because A, they had practically no time to do that. ABC wasn't giving them a break to try and figure things out, and B, as a fan myself, I would have been devastated to lose Hannibal Hayes as a character. He and Kid are the show, they're partners. They don't split up. So that would probably mean killing Hayes off screen and coming up with some contrived reason for some new reformed outlaw to want amnesty and have to team up with Kid Curry. And that just sounds horrible. It would have been far, far worse than what we got, in my opinion. Huggins immediately suggested Roger Davis for the job. After all, he was familiar with the show, and he'd worked on The Young Country for Huggins. He knew that his style was different from Pete's, but they still felt it would work for the character. Larson's only reservation was that Davis had just been in an episode as a villain, which is a fair point, but again, you're working against the clock here. The decision was made to hire Roger Davis as Hayes before they even spoke to the man, before he even knew that Pete, who I will remind you was a friend of his, was dead. So let's talk about Roger Davis, shall we? Davis was born in Kentucky. He was the middle child of his family, and he took an interest in acting at an early age. But when he went to college, he majored in American and British Lit. He still acted while keeping up with all of his schoolwork. He took a job teaching English at the University of California, but he also had to work side jobs like waiting tables and washing dishes, etc. Really? A teacher had to take side jobs? What in the Breaking Bad is that nonsense about? Anyway, he ended up with a master's degree, which, cool, good for him. That requires a level of commitment to academics that I simply don't understand. He signed a contract with Warner Brothers and started to get work right away. He got a short-lived series called The Gallant Man about a World War II company in Italy. During his time at Warner's, he made friends with Robert Conrad, Jim West himself. Around that time, he and Pete's fate started to intertwine. They met when they were up for the same part in a beach movie with Tab Hunter called Ride the Wild Surf. Roger ended up getting that part. They met again when Roger turned down the lead role in Love on a Rooftop, leaving the part open for Pete. And I really can't picture Roger in that role. He just doesn't have that innocent look to him that Pete had. Truly, they couldn't look more opposite. I mean they could, but I guess for two white guys, they couldn't. Soon, Roger kind of stumbled into voiceover work, which has really been his bread and butter. He was playing Bobby Kennedy in a play, and he went in for a commercial audition doing his Kennedy voice. The producers thought it was too close and they'd get sued, so they just had him do it in his normal voice, which they thought sounded a bit like Henry Fonda. And yeah, that's fair, I can agree with that. He does have a certain Fonda-esque quality. They asked him if he could do it even more Fonda-like, and he obliged. Roger said of his voiceover career, quote, "A career in voiceovers, which made me millions of bucks, was born, so I had this great voiceover career, doing plays and starting to do lots of commercials on camera," end quote. And after that came his biggest claim to fame outside of ASJ, which was his role on Dark Shadows. He ended up playing multiple roles on that show. Peter Bradford, Jeff Clark, Ned Stewart, Dirk Wilkins, Charles Delaware Tate, and, of course, the ghost of Peter Bradford. What a weird show. All in all, he did a total of 129 episodes and appeared in one of the Dark Shadows movies. Roger and Pete met again when they were cast in The Young Country. Initially, Pete was cast as the lead and Roger as the villain, but Huggins decided the two of them ought to switch roles. Roger worried that Pete would resent him for basically getting demoted from lead to supporting, but Pete wasn't that kind of guy. He was fine switching parts with Rogers. He even joked with him, quote, "I followed you into Love on a Rooftop, and now I'm following you into The Young Country. What kind of a life is this?" End quote. He became friends with Huggins as well during the production of that show. It's how he got the job as narrator for ASJ. Back to December 31st, Roger and his then-wife Jacqueline Smith, yes, that Jacqueline Smith, were at the airport that morning. Two airline workers were questioning the passengers asking if they were Roger Davis. Finally, they found him. They got him on the phone with Huggins. At first, Roger didn't understand exactly what Huggins was saying. He heard Pete had been shot and I guess assumed he was merely injured and was being asked to step in for a few episodes. Kind of like on Wild Wild West when Ross Martin had his heart attack. Finally, Huggins bluntly told him that Peter had shot himself and was dead. If Roger didn't come back to LA as fast as he could to do the show, it would get canceled. Barely able to take all this in, Roger asked if he had a choice. Huggins said, quote, "From my point of view, I hope you don't. I do want you to think about it, but I hope that you will do it." End quote. Yeah, no pressure or anything. Roger dutifully took the next flight back to LA. By the time his plane landed, the press was already running stories about him being Pete's replacement. Good God, people. He was taken straight from the airport to the Western Costume Company. Swirling was there to greet him and put together a new wardrobe for Hayes that would better suit Roger. Huggins held private meetings that weekend for Roger and Alexander Singer so they could get to know each other and go over the material together before Roger had to face the cast and crew. I truly cannot imagine all the emotions going through that poor man's head during that time. I would feel sick. I feel a little sick just reading about it. I just want to be absolutely clear. I completely understand and sympathize with fans who have never watched a Roger Davis episode, and for them the show died with Pete. I get it. I've been there myself with other fandoms. But I have read some pretty gross and hateful things about Roger from some fans online, and that I don't like. None of what happened, not any of it, is his fault. He didn't cause this. He didn't decide to keep the show running. He didn't ask for the role. He took a job under horrific circumstances and did the best he could. And honestly, his best was pretty good in my opinion. I love Pete as Hayes. I do. He was charming, full of charisma, funny, dangerous when he needed to be, and very, very cute. He always had that twinkle in his eye that just lights me up when I watch him. But I'm not going to downplay or ignore Roger's work on the show. Like it or not, he is part of it and part of its legacy. Pete Duel completed 32 episodes of ASJ. Roger completed 18. He worked hard, even though he was not having a good time, and I respect that. And again, Peter was his friend. He was dealing with the loss of him too. Sorry, I just wanted to get that off my chest. Now, where was I? Right, so on January 3rd, 1971, shooting on the series resumed with Roger Davis as Hannibal Hayes. Everyone showed up to set except for the DP, who had been a close friend of Pete's and couldn't face going back to work on the episode. It's completely understandable. He did come back later to finish out the season. Ben is of the belief that canceling the show would have been the best course of action, but since it wasn't his call, he went back to work. Quote, "I could have been a thorn in their side and been petulant and said, no, I can't go on, but that would have been bullshit. My job is to be an actor and do a job. I can't quit because someone else chooses to end their life." End quote. To catch up on time, they planned to use footage they already had of guest stars, which unfortunately meant that Roger had to duplicate Pete's performance so that his reactions would match properly. That really sucks. He couldn't even put his own mark on the character in his first episode. Singer and Roger carefully studied the footage of Pete so that Roger could capture it as best he could. Singer praised Roger for getting through it with professionalism and goodwill. After lunch, he and Roger went to view dailies on a big screen. As they walked, Roger broke down and cried. He told Singer he felt lucky to get a role like this, but that Pete was his friend and he hated the situation. According to Singer, that was the only time Roger let himself break on the set like that. Whatever else he may have been going through, he kept it to himself. While this was going on, Ben was having a shitty day too, to say the least. Quote, "It was like waking up in bed with a different wife. That's the way I best describe it. It was emotionally just very, very difficult." End quote. I mean, here the man is redoing scenes he had just done a few days ago with Pete, his on-screen partner for the last year, with somebody else. That would throw anybody for a loop. Quote, "It wasn't fun for Roger. It wasn't fun for me. Wasn't fun for anybody." End quote. Between shots, Ben went to his dressing room to be alone. Someone else had to feed lines to Roger during his close-ups. Roger was still in a state of shock over the whole thing and didn't think much of it. But one of the guest stars for the episode, Jim Backus, was pissed, thinking Ben's behavior was unconscionable and had no problem saying it to Ben's face. Dude, I get that, but I'll keep saying it like a broken record. These were extreme circumstances. Ben wasn't being a diva just because he could. He was trying to deal with this new reality he was stuck in. I can't blame him here at all, and I really think it's unfair to get in his face about it. Singer later said that even though Pete's temperament would slow the crew down sometimes, he was still very well liked among the set. They all had a hard time getting through the episode. Quote, "For all the behavioral things that were troublesome or irritating about Peter, he was a beautiful young man and a very good actor." End quote. To add insult to injury, the network that forced them to keep filming didn't even acknowledge Pete's passing or their pain. No one came down to the set to check on them or reach out or anything at all. The show ended up losing only a half a day of production. Swerling justified it to himself by saying that 125 jobs were saved by keeping the show rolling. True, but still, again, can they maybe get, a week off? Once the episode was complete, ABC sent tapes of the show out to some of their stations to show it early to gauge audience reaction. The results were encouraging, so ABC felt the show could survive without Pete. Throughout the rest of season 2, the ratings did not significantly drop, so ASJ was given a third season. One last bit of bullshit that Ben had to endure. When Pete was on the show, he was making $5,000 an episode. Ben was making $450 a week. That is one hell of a discrepancy. I mean, what is Ben, a woman? When Roger came on, he was given Pete's salary, and that pissed Ben off. Totally fair. Quote, "You're bringing in another actor. I should at least get what he gets, and I shouldn't have to take second billing to a new person if we're going to do this." End quote. Yeah, I'd say that's absolutely right. Ben held out until eventually he got a fair deal. He was kind enough to finish season 2 at his original pay, but got the equal pay he wanted for season 3. Good for him. The show was going on. Before I close this episode, I think Joe Swerling sums up my feelings for the Roger Davis era of the series. Quote, "I just don't think the show had quite the same flavor. It was close. I think it was remarkably close, but not quite the same." End quote. That is spot on. The rest of season 2 and season 3 isn't bad, or at least it's not significantly worse than the show has been up to this point, but it is missing that spark that I think came from Pete and Ben's wonderful lightning-in-a-bottle chemistry. How will the series change from here on out? We'll find out together. Next time on Alias Smith & Jones, Hannibal Hayes manages to get involved in the biggest poker game in the West. Research for this podcast comes mainly from the wonderful book Alias Smith & Jones, The Story of Two Pretty Good Bad Men, by Sandra K. Segala and Joanne M. Bagwell. Additional research comes from Mysteries and Scandals, the Pete Duel Memorial Site, and the articles The Truth Behind Pete Duel's Death by Richard Morris from Motion Picture, April 1972, an interview with Glenn A. Larson by Douglas Snaffer for Epilogue Journal, Spring 1994, and Pete Duel, Too Much Too Soon by Fenton Bressler from Women's Own, June 29th, 1974. And I will leave you with Pete's own words.
I'm going to leave you with this. I wrote this in 1965. And it's called Love. Love. An infinitesimal piece of starbreak that drifts into consciousness, entering in pastel ways to become simply love. Thanks for listening. Peace and ecology now.